The axiom of Maria is a precept in alchemy. Quote, "One becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth." It is attributed to 3rd century alchemist Maria Prophetissa, also called the Jewess, sister of Moses, or the Copt. Marie-Louise von France gives an alternative version of this. Quote, "Out of the one comes two, out of the two comes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth." And so it seems to me that one way of thinking of Marie-Louise's version of that is to think in terms of a family, where out of the one, the individual comes together with normally a person of the opposite sex, and they have a marriage, so that becomes two, and then the two become three. They have a child, and so once they have a child, that creates a state of consciousness as a family. So that's back to the one, which is the fourth thing. And so this description goes on. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung used the axiom as a metaphor for the process of individuation. One is unconscious wholeness. Two is the conflict of opposites. Three points to a potential resolution. The third is the transcendent function, described as a psychic function that arises from the tension between consciousness and the unconscious and supports their union. And the one is the fourth, is a transformed state of consciousness, relatively whole and at peace. So once again, let's see. So Dr. Jung is putting it in terms of the state of consciousness and the unconscious. And what I would add to this is that this is about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And so the one is the thesis, the two is the antithesis, coming up, the division, the separation of opposites. The synthesis is the third thing, the coming together. And in a family, you could think of that as the father, the mother coming together as the two, the synthesis being the child, and then that becomes a new one, which is a family rather than an individual. And so that's the basic idea of the axiom of Maria. And so we could think of it in terms of our current events today, where we have a state of consciousness in the fact that the government is shut down at the current state. And immediately after the first of the year 2019, the Congress is going to convene and offer a duality for that, in that it's going to offer a solution to that current state of being. And assuming that the Congress offers a solution, then we're going to see that presented to the president, and that will be the duality. If the president accepts it, he will sign the Congress's solution and the government will reopen. That's the synthesis. And if the president denies it, that will also be a synthesis, because it will put things back to a new state of consciousness, and Congress will have to try again. So that will introduce a fourth state, whereas Congress offers a solution. The president either accepts or denies the solution in his role in duality. His acceptance or denial amounts to the synthesis from that duality as it was presented, and then we have a new state of being, a state of consciousness, which will be the new state, whether the government is open or not, and then we'll go back and try again. And so that's a very simplistic example of the axiom of Maria in current affairs, but I wanted to give you a sense of that before I go ahead and read these paragraphs. So, I'm reading today from Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung, paragraphs 25 to 31. And yesterday I concluded the reading by reading about half of paragraph 25, but I think it bears repeating, so I'm going to read the beginning of paragraph 25 once more. Christianity has made the antinomy of good and evil. Now, an antinomy is a duality or an opposition, so I'll just start that again. Christianity has made the antinomy of good and evil into a world problem, and by formulating the conflict dogmatically, raised it to an absolute principle. Into this, as yet unresolved conflict, the Christian is cast as a protagonist of good, a fellow player in the world drama. Understood in its deepest sense, being Christ's follower involves a suffering that is unendurable to the great majority of mankind. Consequently, the example of Christ is in reality followed either with reservation or not at all, and the pastoral practice of the Church even finds itself obliged to lighten the yoke of Christ. This means a pretty considerable reduction in the severity and harshness of the conflict, and hence, in practice, a relativism of good and evil. Good is equivalent to the unconditional imitation of Christ, and evil is its hindrance. Man's moral weakness and sloth are what chiefly hinder the imitation, and it is to these that probabilism extends a practical understanding which may sometimes, perhaps, come nearer to Christian tolerance, mildness, and love of one's neighbor than the attitude of those who see in probabilism a mere laxity. Although one must concede a number of cardinal Christian virtues to the probabilistic endeavor, one must not overlook the fact that it obviates much of the suffering involved in the imitation of Christ, and that the conflict of good and evil is thus robbed of its harshness and toned down to tolerable proportions. Now remember, in yesterday's reading, I read the definition of probabilism, and basically it does relate to toning back down the harshness of evil on the psyche, which is the same thing that confession does. If you go to confessional, the priest absolves you of your sins, or the same thing as guilt tripping does. If you blame somebody else, then it's not your fault, and you can go on living. This brings about an approach to the psychic archetype of the self, where even these opposites seem to be united, though, as I say, it differs from the Christian symbolism, which leaves the conflict open. For the latter, For the latter, there is a rift running through the world. Light wars against night. Light wars against night, and the upper against the lower. The two are not one, as they are in the psychic archetype. But even though religious dogma may condemn the idea of two being one, religious practice does, as we have seen, allow the natural psychological symbol of the self at one with itself and approximate means of expression. On the other hand, dogma insists that three are one, while denying that four are one. Since olden times, not only in the West but also in China, uneven numbers have been regarded as masculine and even numbers as feminine. The Trinity is therefore a decidedly masculine deity, of which the androgyny of Christ and the special position and veneration accorded to the Mother of God are not the real equivalent. So this is where we come into the Axiom of Maria. Paragraph 26. With this statement, which may strike the reader as peculiar, we come to one of the central axioms of alchemy, namely the saying of Maria Prophetissa: one becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth. As the reader has already seen from its title, this book is concerned with the psychological significance of alchemy, and thus with a problem which, with very few exceptions, has so far eluded scientific research. Until quite recently, science was interested only in that part of alchemy played in the history. Until quite recently, science was interested only in the part that alchemy played in the history of chemistry, concerning itself very little with the part it played in the history of philosophy and religion. The importance of alchemy, and I might add politics, as I described a little earlier in this video. The importance of alchemy for the historical development of chemistry is obvious, but its cultural importance is still so little known that it seems almost impossible to say in a few words wherein that consisted. In this introduction, therefore, I have attempted to outline the religious and psychological problems which are germane to the theme of alchemy. The point is that alchemy is rather like an undercurrent to the Christianity that ruled on the surface. It is to this surface as the dream is to consciousness. And just as the dream compensates the conflicts of the conscious mind, so alchemy endeavors to fill in the gaps left open by the Christian tension of opposites. Perhaps the most pregnant expression of this is the axiom of Maria Prophetissa, quoted above, which runs like a leitmotif throughout almost the whole of the lifetime of alchemy, extending over more than 17 centuries. In this aphorism, the even numbers, which signify the feminine principle, earth, the regions under the earth, and evil itself, are interpolated between the uneven numbers of the Christian dogma. They are personified by the serpent's Mercury, the dragon that creates and destroys itself and represents the prima materia. This fundamental idea of alchemy points back to the Tehom. Now, the Tehom is Genesis 1:2, and so let me just read that. The Tehom comes from the Holy Bible in Genesis, and verse 1:2 reads, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." Okay. All right, so I'll reread that sentence so that you now know what Tehom is. This fundamental idea of alchemy points back to the Tehom, to Tiamat with her dragon attribute, and thus to the primordial matriarchal world, which, in the theomachy of the Marduk myth, was overthrown by the masculine world of the father. The historical shift in the world's consciousness towards the masculine is compensated at first by the chthonic femininity of the unconscious. In certain pre-Christian religions, the differentiation of the masculine principle had taken the form of the father-son specification, a change which was to be of the utmost importance for Christianity. Were the unconscious merely complementary, the shift of consciousness would have been accompanied by the production of a mother and daughter, for which the necessary material lay ready at hand in the myth of Demeter and Persephone. But as alchemy shows, the unconscious chose rather the Sibyl Attis type in the form of the prima materia and the filius macrocosmi, thus proving that it is not complementary, but compensatory. This goes to show that the unconscious does not simply act contrary to the conscious mind, but modifies it more in the manner of an opponent or partner. This is wives trying to change their husbands, presumably. The sun type does not call up a daughter as a complementary image from the depths of the chthonic unconscious. It calls up another sun. This remarkable fact would seem to be connected with the incarnation in our earthly human nature of a purified spiritual God brought about by the Holy Ghost impregnating the womb of the Blessed Virgin. Thus, the higher, the spiritual, the masculine, inclines to the lower, the earthly, the feminine, and accordingly the mother, who was anterior to the world of the father, accommodates herself to the masculine principle, and with the aid of the human spirit, alchemy or philosophy, produces a son, not the antithesis of Christ, but rather his chthonic counterpart, not a divine man, but a fabulous being conforming to the nature of the primordial mother. And just as the redemption of man, the microcosm is the task of the upper sun, so the lower sun has the function of Salvator Macrocosmi, as the savior of the cosmos. This, in brief, is the drama that was played out in the obscurities of alchemy. It is superfluous to remark that these two suns were never united, except perhaps in the mind and innermost experience of a few particularly gifted alchemists. But it is not very difficult to see the purpose of this drama. In the incarnation, it looked as though the masculine principle of the father world were approximating to the feminine principle of the mother world, with the result that the latter felt impelled to approximate in turn to the father world. What is evidently amounted to was an attempt to bridge the gulf separating the two worlds as compensation for the open conflict between them. I hope the reader will not be offended by my exposition. Paragraph 28. I hope the reader will not be offended by my Paragraph 28. I hope the reader will not be offended if my exposition sounds like a Gnostic myth. We are moving in those psychological regions where, as a matter of fact, gnosis is rooted. The message of the Christian symbol is gnosis, and the compensation effected by the unconscious is gnosis in even higher degree. Myth is the primordial language natural to these psychic processes, and no intellectual formulation comes anywhere near the richness and expressiveness of the mythical imagery. Such processes are concerned with the primordial images, and these are best and most succinctly reproduced by figurative language. Paragraph 29. The process described above displays all the characteristic features of psychological compensation. We know that the mask of the unconscious is not rigid. It reflects the face we turn towards it. Hostility lends it a threatening aspect. Friendliness softens its features. It is not a question of mere optical reflection, but of an autonomous answer, which reveals the self-sufficing nature of that which answers. Thus, the filius philosophorum is not just the reflected image in unsuitable material of the Son of God. On the contrary, this son of Tiamat reflects the features of the primordial maternal figure. Although he is decidedly hermaphroditic, he has a masculine name, a sign that the chthonic underworld, having been rejected by the spirit and identified with evil, has a tendency to compromise. There is no mistaking the fact that he is a concession to the spiritual and masculine principle, even though he carries in himself the weight of the earth and the whole fabulous nature of primordial animality. Welcome to the reading. Two more paragraphs to read. Paragraph 30. This answer of the mother world shows that the gulf between it and the father world is not unbridgeable, seeing that the unconscious holds the seeds of the unity of both. The essence of the conscious mind is discrimination. It must, if it is to be aware of things, separate the opposites. It must, if it is to be aware of things, separate the opposites, and it does this contra naturam. In nature, the opposites seek one another. Les extremes se touchent, the extremes touch one another. And so it is in the unconscious, and particularly in the archetype of unity, the self. Here, as in the deity, the opposites cancel out. But as soon as the unconscious begins to manifest itself, they split asunder, as at the creation. For every act of dawning consciousness is a creative act, and it is from this psychological experience that all our cosmogonic symbols are derived. Okay, that's a pretty important paragraph. I'm going to come back to it. Good evening, Buzz. Thank you for joining me. Okay, so paragraph 31. Alchemy is preeminently concerned with the seed of unity, which lies hidden in the chaos of Tiamat and forms the counterpart to the divine unity. Like this, the seed of unity has a Trinitarian character in Christian alchemy and a triadic character in pagan alchemy. According to other authorities, it corresponds to the unity of the four elements and is therefore a quaternity. The overwhelming majority of the modern psychological findings speaks in favor of the latter view. The few cases I have observed which produced the number 3 were marked by a systematic deficiency in consciousness, that is to say, by an unconsciousness of the inferior function. The number 3, why my nose is suddenly itching. The number 3 is not a natural expression of wholeness, since 4 represents the minimum number of determinants in a whole judgment. It must nevertheless be stressed that side by side with the distinct leanings of alchemy and of the unconscious towards quaternity, there is always a vacillation between 3 and 4, which comes out over and over again. Even in the axiom of Maria Prophetissa, the quaternity is muffled and alembicated. In alchemy, there are 3 as well as 4 regimena, or procedures, 3 as well as 4 colors. There are always 4 elements, but often 3 of them are grouped together, with the 4th in a special position, sometimes earth, sometimes fire. Mercurius is, of course, quadratus, but he is also a 3-headed snake, or simply a triunity. This uncertainty has a duplex character. In other words, the central ideas are ternary as well as quaternary. The psychologist cannot but mention the fact that a similar puzzle exists in the psychology of the unconscious. The least differentiated or inferior function is so much contaminated with the collective unconscious that, on becoming conscious, it brings up among others the archetype of the self, as well as Maria Prophetissa says. 4 signifies the feminine, motherly, physical; 3 the masculine, fatherly, spiritual. Thus, the uncertainty as to 3 or 4 amounts to a wavering between the spiritual and the physical, a striking example of how every human truth is a last truth but one. Okay, now let me read you the footnote for Mercurius. In alchemical writings, the word Mercurius is used with a very wide range of meaning. To denote only the chemical element mercury, or quicksilver, Mercury, Hermes the god, and Mercury the planet, but also and primarily the secret transforming substance, which is at the same time the spirit indwelling in all living creatures. These different connotations will become apparent in the course of this book. It would be misleading to use the English Mercury and Mercury because there are innumerable. It would be misleading to use the English capital letter Mercury or small letter Mercury because there are innumerable passages where neither word does justice to the wealth of the implications. It has therefore been decided to retain the Latin Mercurius, as in the German text, and to use the personal pronoun, since Mercurius is personified, the word quicksilver being employed only when the chemical element Hg is plainly meant. That's from an author's note for the English edition. Now let me go back here. So I want to re-emphasize this paragraph 30. This answer of the mother world shows that the gulf between it and the father world is not unbridgeable, seeing that the unconscious holds the seed of the unity of both. The essence of the conscious mind is discrimination. It must, if it is to be aware of things, separate the opposites. And it does this contra naturam. In nature, the opposites seek one another. Les extremes se touchent. And so it is in the unconscious, and particularly in the archetype of unity, the self. Here, as in the deity, the opposites cancel out. But as soon as the unconscious begins to manifest itself, they split asunder, as at the creation, For every act of dawning consciousness is a creative act, and it is from this psychological experience that all cosmogonic symbols are derived. Now, I want to talk about this again in the context of the government shutdown that we are experiencing at the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2019. So it is that we have one situation, that is, the government is shut down. And so that's a single situation. But that is going to become two things, because it will be the government is shut down, but number two, Congress is doing something about it. And that becomes then a duality between Congress and the president becomes the antithesis. Will he accept the Congress's decision or not? And so he will either sign the new bill, which will come out from the new Congress on January 3rd, or will he reject it? And so that's the thesis and antithesis. Then he will make a decision. If he vetoes it, we will have a third state, and if he doesn't veto it, again, we will have a third state, and that will be the situation at that point of time. And then from that situation, which is a family of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, then we will have one, which is a state at that point in time, and from that state at that point of time comes a fourth, and the fourth is the new step forward, which again becomes then a duality. And we go through that process again and again at so many different levels in our government, in our psyche, in our philosophy, in our religions. And this is what alchemy is all about when we talk about it in terms of psychology. Namely, we put ingredients into a bowl and we stir them around and we see whether we get something that's good or bad for us. And then from that, we add something else and so on. And so it's a process. It's a multi-generational process. But in terms of a nation state, as in terms of a country like the United States, we have been doing this for 400 years, putting different ideas into the bowl and mixing them around, and sometimes that mixture can be quite toxic, as it was in the Civil War, as it is to a limited extent today, a more limited extent today, but ultimately it's going to result in where the country is 6 months from now or 12 months from now. And so Dr. Jung's point is that even in the canton of Zurich, there were many civil wars going on all the time because people don't agree about much of anything. Reminds me of the Kingston Trio's song, The Merry Minuet, which is they're rioting in Africa, there's strife in Iran. What nature doesn't do to us will be done by our fellow man. So we're constantly trying to change the situation, and that's what alchemy is about and what the psychology of an individual is about, as well as the psychology of nation states. So anyway, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Buzz says, do you think that Mercury and Cinnabar were looked at as the representation of the phoenix rising from its ashes by the alchemists? I do not know. I am not sufficiently familiar with that. However, I will tell you where you can find out. There is this book by Edward Edinger, The Anatomy of the Psyche, Alchemical Symbolism in Psychotherapy. And I believe you can find this book in our Dropbox in electronic form. And if you don't find it there, you can send me a note and I will see if I can get it for you to put in the Dropbox only for the group study that we're doing. And this book, The Anatomy of the Psyche by Edward Edinger, is a fairly full explication of the alchemical process as the alchemists practiced it. Now, Dr. Jung is trying to explain where he's coming from, and of course we are through now paragraph 31 of something like 485 paragraphs in this book, Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung. Now, as I explained earlier, the first 47 paragraphs of this book constitute Dr. Jung's overall concept of religion as he saw it and later explicated it in places like Answer to Job, Ion researches into the phenomenology of the self, and in Mysterium Conjunctionis. So this is a summation of his religious perspective, is what I read in the preface here. And then there are two major essays in here, which were delivered at the Aranos conferences in Ascoli, Italy in 1936 and 1937. And so it's those two major essays, and then a final closeout section. So that's what this book is about. And what I'm trying to do, what I have experienced myself, and the reason I'm doing this is I find this material very hard to comprehend the first time through. It's not possible to read this book like a novel. You just cannot. And what I find is that it's much easier for me if I can listen to a reading of a book and understand it. And then usually after the second and third reading, I start to get it in terms of Dr. Jung's writing. And so I'm hoping to help others with that and myself, because as I read it, then if I force myself to explain it from my perspective, you may not agree with me, and that's perfectly okay. That's entirely up to you. But at least I'm trying to make it accessible, because it's very hard to read just straight up. I mean, if you're reading it as a book, you can easily hypnotize yourself or put yourself to sleep in 10 minutes and trying to do this, because what Dr. Jung is doing is he's saying things that may be contrary to everything you ever learned about anything. And so your mind starts to spin, and that's when hypnosis can step in. And as some of you may have seen, I sometimes do literally fall asleep in the middle of a reading, and I've put that in some of the outtakes at the end so that you can understand how difficult it is for me as well. And so, by the way, this image here over my right shoulder is Maria Prophetissa, as depicted in Wikipedia. And so I thought I would put her on this because I was describing the Axiom of Maria. I hope that description is helpful. I know that throughout my study of Dr. Jung's work. The Axiom of Maria has always been a little bit of a mystery to me, and I didn't quite get what she was talking about. But if you think of two states of being, so you have antithesis, you have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and a new state, which is the one again, then you start to get it. In other words, you have, and thinking about it in terms of a family, you have one person, either a man or a woman, and that's a thesis, but that's all it is a thesis. Then you have the opposite, which is the antithesis, either man or woman, and then you have the synthesis, which takes place in the womb of the woman, and when that child is born, that is the synthesis of the thesis and antithesis. So the child is born, and that creates the fourth thing, which is a family. It's not an individual, which was at the beginning of the first thing. It is a fourth thing, or is a third thing, which is a child, and that third thing is also a fourth thing, which is a family. Now you have a family, which again is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and that goes on, and it happens at different points in time. So that's why it's a process, and it's a psychological process. I hope that's clear. It's not easy to explain, and it's not easy to explain in this way, but at least that's my perspective on it. And Buzz says, have you thought in terms of Venn diagrams about this, perhaps? No, I have not. Let me think. Venn diagrams. What you're talking about, Buzz, when you say something like that, you are talking about the rational, okay? So you are, again, as in anything, okay, as in any book, okay? Here's the word, okay? And any book or any way of presenting one of these ideas, including my presentation over the last 5 minutes, comes from logic, comes from the rational side of being. And all such things are helpful. So to the extent that you or I could put together a Venn diagram that explains the Axiom of Maria, that could be helpful in terms of grokking it, but it doesn't really capture everything about it, okay? And that has to come from a symbol, and what is that symbol? Well, maybe it's the Great Mother or something like that, because if we go back to Genesis 1:2, we realize that God is feminine at this point, okay, in terms of the way Christianity has come down to us now through all these millennia, at least 3.5 millennia. If the earth is without form and void, and the darkness is upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, that darkness and without form must be in the feminine. And then God said, let there be light, and so that was a rational act, okay, let there be light, and then he separated the light from the darkness. So in Genesis 1:4, and God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. So there was the first duality, and that was a rational act. And so we can see this happening throughout the religious warfare of the last 2,000 years, where Protestant Christianity, every time a new form of Protestantism comes up, then there's a division and you have another one. So my understanding is that there are about 400 different Protestant sects in Christianity. And so, why do we have to choose whether we are Baptist or Lutheran or Episcopal or what have you in Protestantism? It's because this process started to happen. And so as soon as you create something, then you start to slice and dice it, and immediately you're creating a duality, something different. And then you have Baptists and Lutherans, let's say, and so what's the synthesis between Baptists and Lutherans? And I don't know. Why are they different? I really don't know. It says, set A and B being the partners and the union producing the subset of the child. Hi, Julie. Welcome. Good afternoon. And Buzz says, good afternoon, Julia. Okay, so I now have played hooky long enough in my other work, so I'm going to have to discontinue this video for today. I've enjoyed doing it. I'm trying to get through the very first part, which is the first 47 paragraphs of Dr. Jung's Psychology and Alchemy, which manifests as the editorial board says, he set out his whole position, particularly in relation to religion, in this first part of Psychology and Alchemy, and what's called Introduction to the Religious in this book. And so that's an area that has been of primary interest to me for many years. As many of you know, I had the experience of at a very emotional time with one of my daughters, where she told me I was going to hell, and within an hour of her telling me that, I had a vision of Mephistopheles sitting down next to me in my car. Now, I know that it was a psychological or a psychogenic experience, but nonetheless, it represents a part of my unconscious, and I must be aware of that. And so the religious aspect of what Dr. Jung talks about has been very important to me for that reason. But anyway, so Julie, I'm sorry that I have to cut off now, but I will make this video for playback, and I think it can be quite interesting because I am trying to explain the axiom of Maria in the context of our everyday life, so that we can see that these processes are going on. And I had a mentor who once said, anytime you add someone to a group or take someone out of a group, you change the group. And what he was referring to there is literally alchemy. When you put an ingredient into something, whether it's a group or something else. So in his context, the group is the vase. When you put something new in, namely a new person, you change the group. And if you take something out, you also change the group. And so it's just like cooking, too. You know, you may want to have essence of raspberry in something you're cooking, but you don't want all the solids from the raspberries. And so what do? You mash the raspberries up in the soup and mix it around, and then you sieve off the solids, and you've left the essence of raspberry in the pudding or whatever it is you're making. That's alchemy too. And so that's sort of the fundamental concept here in the context of psychology, that we keep putting things into our psyches and into our national psyches and into every group that we have in our life, whether it's the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or anything else. These things are constantly in motion, and they represent everything. So I did have a comment earlier, which I got disappeared very quickly, but the comment was, why did Dr. Jung only talk about wealthy or powerful people in his work? And I think that that's a misconception. Yes, the examples that he uses in his work are often from fairly intellectual people and people who had enough vision to understand what he was talking about during the 20th century. That is true, but that was all informed by his having spent 10 years or so at the Bergholzli in Zurich, which was a mental hospital, and those were psychotics and neurotics who were hospitalized. So they were of, they were the type of people that were simple people and people who had lost their ability to even cope with the world. And so it isn't that he was only informed by wealthy people or powerful people. When they met him, he was bringing to them, without saying so, he was bringing to them all of his experience with even psychotics and many other people who he had experienced up until then. So let's keep in mind that he became a psychiatrist in about the year 1900, and at least until 1912, he was mainly dealing with people in psychiatric hospitals. It was only around the time that he broke his relationship with Dr. Freud that he then started his own practice outside. And so from my perspective, he does bring those experiences of working with people who weren't powerful or wealthy into his writing, but he doesn't necessarily refer to them. Sometimes he does. I mean, he does mention it in Man and His Symbols. He mentions it in Memory Streams Reflections and other places. So it's not only that. And so I'm glad to know that I've been helpful to you, Julie, during this year. I really appreciate knowing that. And I don't ask you to tell me how, but if you want to, that's fine. And you don't have to do it publicly. So anyway, I will do my best to do another reading tomorrow in an endeavor to get through this before the end of this coming week. But if I don't see you again before the end of the year, have a happy new year, and I hope that 2019 is not as tense as 2018 has been. I wish everyone a happy life. And as the Dalai Lama wrote a book called The Art of Happiness, and it amounts to this song where you emphasize the good and de-emphasize the bad in your life, and that's how you find happiness. So I wish you that for 2019. So with that, I will discontinue this for today. So peace on earth.